Order. I call to order today's House of Commons Defence Committee evidence session on our regular session on women in the armed forces. It's been 5 years since the Atherton report, so I think this is a very pertinent and timely regular session. And I am very, very pleased that we have got with us an esteemed panel, including Minister for Veterans and People, Louise Sandher-Jones, MP. I believe, Minister, it's your first outing in front of the Defence Committee, so a very warm welcome to you, as it is also, I believe, for General Sir Gwyn Jenkins, the First Sea Lord, and a very warm welcome also to the Chief of the General Staff, General Sir Roly and the Chief of the Air Staff, Air Chief Marshal Harv Smyth, and a warm welcome again to the Director of Conduct, Equity and Justice at the Ministry of Defence, Sandher-Jones. Ladies and gents, before I go on to today's very important session, I think it would be very remiss of me as Chair to not mention the major intervention overnight from Lord Robertson, who actually chaired the Strategic Defence Review for the government. Minister, if I may very briefly come onto that, I don't want it to, the reason I'm doing this at the outset is I don't want this to actually impress upon the wider session. So just very briefly on this, Lord Robertson has said that the government's corrosive complacency on defence spending has put the UK in peril, and he's in fact accused non-military experts in the Treasury of vandalism. You'll be aware that the Defence Committee has repeatedly been asking for defence spending to be accelerated and for the publication of the Defence Investment Plan. You know, are people right to mock the state of defence spending, and you know, is there a difference of view now at the helm of the government, given what Lord Robertson is saying, and given where we are on defence spending?
Yeah, so when, George Robertson, I've got a huge amount of respect for him, and obviously the work that he put into the Strategic Defence Review was a phenomenal piece of work. And I think it's fair to say that we really recognise the importance of the recommendations. We've accepted them. We are progressing at a pace. Some of them have already been delivered. We've made commitments to spend more in this Parliament on defence than has been spent for a very, very long time. I know you're all very familiar with those commitments. He rightly recognises the challenges that we face at the moment are very serious, certainly in my lifetime, incredibly serious, whether we look at Eastern Europe or the Middle East. And so, as I said, I've got a huge amount of respect for him and what he has to say. But I would just gently say we are working very hard to deliver against the recommendations, and we are working very hard. We have already started investments. I can point to various investments that we've made on kit and equipment. It's great that people are always urging us to go further and faster. I'm somebody who always wants to go further and faster for sure. But I think we also have to recognise that we are putting in a lot of hard work to get this country ready for the challenges that we are facing.
Minister, with all due respect, the Prime Minister is constantly talking about further and faster. We've heard that. We've heard about how people are working at pace to deliver on the Defence Investment Plan. Can you give us a date when that might be published?
I'm not going to do that today. I would point out, say that we are making investments without the DIP being finalised. A lot of people are working very, very hard. I'm sure everybody here would recognise the importance of getting this right. This is a hugely, hugely important piece of work. We've got to get it right. And it's right that people are taking the time to do that. Right.
Well, look, I now want to move on to the core substance of today's debate. And in terms of women in the armed forces, I think many of us have been concerned that there seems to be a lack of progress. The key metrics on women in the armed forces just haven't moved, and there are many different individuals now at the helm, including yourself, Minister. So we're hoping that there is going to be a sea change of the way that the working is going to be from henceforth. But what are you going to do differently from what your predecessors have done to move some of these metrics?
Yeah, and I think, if you'll allow me, I just kind of want to start answering that by reflecting on the journey that's brought me here, right? As you know, I served in the armed forces. I served in the army. I was an officer in the intelligence corps for a few years. And, I think it's worth saying up front, I had a fantastic time serving in the military. The experiences it gave me, the lessons I learnt, and the people I worked with above and beyond were incredible. And I would do it all again in a heartbeat. But I also know that isn't the case for everybody. Even with my own experience, which I say was hugely positive, I can always say, oh yeah, but this also happened as well. And so being given the huge honour and the huge privilege to be sat here in this role, I'm very aware of the difference that we need to make and the extra responsibility and duty that I feel to represent women in the armed forces and to keep us moving forwards. It's certainly been, I think, surprising to me just how far we've come. So I would just sort of gently push back that there's a need for like a sea change, because I think the progress that we've made since I left has been surprising to me, the pace of change. For example, the efforts to improve the service justice system, for example, have been fantastic to see. The efforts to improve the supply of menstruation products, the efforts to improve kit and how that fits is fantastic. So I think, we'll get into the details of what we're doing, I'm sure, but I think when I look across at what we're doing, I can really see that we are making strides forwards. And I feel from some of the things that I hear and some of the things that I see, both the good, the excellent, and the not good, that this is something that is so personal to me, so personal. And I just, personally for me, I just want to make sure that when I come to the end in this job, I look back and I said that I did everything that I could to make the armed forces, because everybody, whether you're male or female, has the right to serve in an armed forces, which is professional, which is respectful, and which is utterly focused on delivering the mission.
I think, Minister, that given your esteemed service for the country, which I've mentioned before in the chamber as well, there are high expectations, especially from yourself, that you will be at the helm of major change. You're right about progress in certain issues, but I think as my colleagues will soon point out, we see that there is a lack of progress in various metrics, but I'll defer to the wisdom of my colleagues now as they go through one by one, because we've got quite a lot to get through. And my request also to members as well as to panellists is please don't feel free the urge to answer every question. And likewise, I would request members that perhaps their questions could be targeted at one or two or three individuals, because otherwise we just will not be able to get through the plethora of issues that we want to get through. Starting off with Calvin Bailey.
Thank you, Chair. So it has been 5 years since the Defence Committee report was released, the Atherton report, protecting those who protect us, women in the armed forces, and recruitment to civilian life. That, as we all recognise, was a significant report with very upsetting and detail of widespread mistreatment of our servicewomen, including sexual harassment, abuse, sexism, lack of suitable safety equipment, including appropriate uniform. And yet we're sat here 5 years on, and the first thing that comes to mind is, why has there been no significant change in women's representation in the armed forces since then? And that's a question to the chiefs. Perhaps by service first.
Well, thank you. So first of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to present today and to answer your questions. I think we all, as a panel here, are gripped by the significance of the topic that we're discussing and why this is so important to the armed forces. Fundamentally, our job as leaders is to prepare the armed forces for conflict. We can only do that if we can build an armed forces that can bring the best of the talent to bear, where everybody can bring everything that they have to offer in order to help us solve the incredibly complex challenges that we face. And that's not just in terms of opponents, that's in terms of the technological pace of change that we see at the moment. We have got to change the armed forces at pace to meet the threats that we see. That was fundamental to the Defence Review when it announced. We can only do that if we can really build high-performing teams. And in the context of the diversity that you need to bring into those teams, people have got to be able to bring the best of themselves into that work. That is one of the core reasons why this is so important to us. I could say, secondly, of course there is a moral obligation here to us. Our people volunteer to serve in order to protect this country. It's beholden on us to safeguard those people so that they are as safe as they can be within the environment within which we operate, in order that they can make those contributions. So I think we all understand the context of why this is so important. In that light, I think we do still see an increase in the number of women joining the Navy in particular with us. So we are up now to over 16% in terms of recruiting. The expressions of interest are up significantly as well from women to join the Royal Navy, and the retention figures continue to improve as well. But even more significantly than that, when we look at the ranks and promotion opportunities within the Navy, the women are overrepresented in terms of how many we're pulling forward on their merits in order to see promotion at almost all ranks at the moment. So I would say that one aspect is a rising level of recruiting. It's not where it needs to be yet, but it is improved. It continues to improve on a steady trajectory. And then a representation that is filtering up in the Navy in terms of our selection for future leaders within the Navy.
Okay, so that's not too dissimilar to what we heard from your predecessor last year, and yet almost after he walked out the door, he manifested some of the things that we are hoping to talk about today. Maybe now is an opportunity to discuss that or point to that as an example of change, or perhaps the existing concerns or the prevailing conditions within the service.
I draw two main lessons from the circumstances in which I took the service over. The first is that there are no excuses, that the standards we set and that we expect apply to everybody, and it doesn't matter if you're a service chief or whether you're the most junior rank within the Navy. We will apply our standards to anyone, and we expect all of us to uphold those standards, particularly as senior leaders. But the second is, and we shouldn't be shy of this, is that is a demonstration of the challenge that we still have ahead of us. That a service chief can be dismissed tells us that we have some way to go on the systemic change that we need to make within our own services and across the armed forces.
Okay, General Walker, just altering the underlying question slightly, some of the progress that we hear about, I think, for a bottom-feeding organisation is perhaps just a manifestation of waiting these people out. That perhaps as framing for my original question, why aren't we seeing any improvements, and why are we only pointing to improvements that are just baked into the system? So we know there were changes, we know the dilution rates were good in the late 90s, early 2000s, and so...
Chair, members of the committee, thank you very much indeed. And I absolutely stand what I said last year when I was presented to this committee around the impact the Atherton report had 5 years ago and the cases of inappropriate behaviour and where we fell short of our standards, that it made me felt ashamed at the way women have been treated, and I stand by that now even more so the more I am in this job. But I have to reflect that there is some cause for a degree of internal pride, and to a degree it's justified. And one of those is, for the first time in our history ever, there is a woman serving at every rank of the British Army, from 4-star general down to private. Now that is a thing. It's not necessarily the most important thing, but it cannot be dismissed as trivial. So that's an example, I think. I take absolutely no credit for the fact the Army's got to that. It's taken a long time to do so, And I'll come back to really who does deserve the credit. But I'm just really proud of being the chief at the time when that happened. Women now make up 11.7% of the army. That has fluctuated over the years. I'd say that's still too low. I fully agree with you, it's too low. And I say that because a nation expects its land forces to be filled with the brightest and the best, and patently we're not accessing all of that talent to society. So for no other reason than we need to get ready, we need to attract the very best of our people. There is a degree of progress. I think female representation at senior ranks has roughly doubled in the last 5 years. And you can look statistically at every rank and grade and cohort and show there has been positive improvements from the other ranks all the way up to senior officers. But I will concede the numbers may be going in the right direction, but they're not going fast enough. And I come back to my previous point, is because we've got to get ready for what may well be coming. We opened the session with one observation of that, and to me we need to attract more people. So I don't think for the army, and I can't speak for the other services, that ambition is our problem, and nor do I think is aspiration our problem. 1 in 5 applicants to the army this year are female. In fact, we have increased it from 20% to 22%, so it's a little bit more than 1 in 5. And that is the highest we've had in 5 years. It has been higher in the past, but contextual factors had to be brought into account. Our challenge, I think, is increasingly not in applications, but it's converting them into trained recruits. And we can come back to that. There's a whole load of interventions that I'd really welcome the opportunity to dive into.
So on that is a specific part of my question. I was going to draw it across, but if you could answer on the conversion.
So, and I'll come back to so once women do join, of course, the data tells us they tend to stay longer. So retention rates for army service women are higher than army service men. So they tend to stay for longer. I know we will get into areas where we fall short on behaviours, and my absolute commitment to the chair and to the committee and to the army and to our people that we will address those. So to the specifics of conversion, it seems to be there is a correlation, I think, with some of the medical entry points where the demands of being an army soldier, and it applies to men as well as to women, is it takes them longer to reach the level of physical and mental resilience to be able to go through the training without getting injured. So we have a whole series of interventions largely informed by the STARE program, which some of you are familiar with, which is this longitudinal study into women in ground close combat, which was run out of the academy at Sandhurst, which has driven data and science into human performance optimization. And I would really welcome the committee taking the chance to go to Sandhurst and be briefed by the scientists and the experts on just what we have learnt from that study for all sexes and all soldiers. And we believe that is leading now into soldier conditioning assessments prior to them taking the physical tests, which then begins to give them an idea of the distance they need to travel, the interventions that are needed through either physiotherapy or strength and conditioning or cardio, whatever it is, whether it's physical. Equally, you can look at nutrition, you can look at sleep patterns, you can look at course construction, the sequencing of training and how that is all evened out to give young people who have shown the determination to serve their country the very best chance we can to get into uniform and follow their career of choice. So there's a whole host of interventions in there which we can definitely follow up on in writing, but my recommendation is please go and see it.
Thank you. And Chief, similar perhaps a focus on the mid-career retention or attrition, particularly within the RAF?
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Thanks, Mr. Bailey. I guess just as an introduction, this is my first stage CDC as the Chief. Obviously, we've done a couple before with the Chairman, but I am glad that this, as CAS, is my first intervention. Because it's such an extremely important topic for all the reasons that have been shared across the panel already. I would also, though, just link this to the fact that it's specifically linked to our development of operational edge, and this has never been more important in a world that's become more and more volatile as each day goes past. And you will all have seen the Royal Air Force in the last 6 to 8 weeks completely deployed across the breadth of the Middle East, responding to the Iran war, performing exceptionally well with an exceptional team. In the 7 months that I've been in this role, I've been crystal clear with the RAF about my approach to both culture and behaviour, about how our ethos of respect, integrity, service and excellence fundamentally underpins our operational edge. So for all the reasons that have been discussed already, alongside this idea of us staying one step ahead of our potential adversaries, of which there are many, and that continues to grow. The ballistic missiles and the one-way attack drones that my people are currently fighting in the Middle East do not discriminate, and neither should we. And the way to protect our people is to have superior forces with superior morale, and that's part of this discussion. I'm in the business of creating an Air Force that represents our country and our communities, and we're seeing that pull through at this moment. That all to say, again, as has been shared here, I know we can always be better, both in terms of the action that we take today to make our processes faster, cleaner, better understood, better trusted, but in parallel, the relentless charge for cultural change, both in single services and across defence as a whole. That cultural change is what I would call Operation Constant Effort. It's a daily quest for us all in these positions. From an Air Force perspective, you'll have all seen the written data that's come through. There's a plethora of data, some of which, just to touch on, at present, women are represented to the tune of 16.5% in the regulars in the Air Force. Actually, what's interesting in our reserve forces, it's closer to 25%, which is a great achievement there. From an expressions of interest, and your point, Calvin, earlier, with much of our engagement through digital media, we're seeing enormous interest, particularly from women across the UK. In 2023, we were seeing about 65,000 expressions of interest. This year, it's double that. It's over 125,000 females reaching in because of what they see on Instagram or social media or many of our media campaigns. It's turning those expressions of interest into those people that are serving in those exceptional teams. That's the challenge. That's the challenge that we're all dealing with on a daily basis. I think one other stat, and then perhaps I'll hand back, is about retention and your point about mid-career. If we look back 2 to 3 years in the service, we were seeing between 8 and 9% of the women in the Royal Air Force leaving earlier than we would have expected. That figure is coming down and it's continuing to trend down. At this moment, it's 6.8%. And that's because of all of these different interventions and mechanisms that we've put in place, some of which we've talked about here, and might feel quite low level: uniform changes, better shoes. There's the day-to-day showing our people that we care about them and that we listen to them. So from my perspective, 7 months into the role, I'm seeing a set of statistics that are trending in the right direction. The trick now is to keep that going and to accelerate it.
Thank you. And as I look past you and see your PSO, who's an example of that, I'd like to thank you and hand back to the Chair.
Thank you very much. On to Jesse Norman.
Thank you very much indeed, Chair. Incredibly important topic, but I think we could be criticised as a committee if we didn't ask at least one of the service chiefs whether they agreed with Lord Robertson. Can I ask you, General Jenkins, whether you think he was right to say there's a corrosive complacency at the top of the defence establishment and in the Treasury?
Very briefly on this, because I don't want, as I said at the outset, I want this to dominate the session. A very, very brief remark, please.
The only thing I can say from the inside is this could not be taken more seriously at the moment. I see no sign of complacency amongst anybody that I work with or provide advice to.
Thank you.
Okay, I noticed you don't mention the Treasury, but thank you for that. The question I want to focus on in relation to the inquiry is about the interventions that make a difference to retaining and developing female members of the armed forces. Maybe General Walker, can you talk a little bit about what interventions have worked in specifically increasing kind of net strength female representation, and what haven't worked, and how you've learnt from that.
Thank you. I mean, I touched on this last year very briefly, but I'll expand on it now. So one of the very interesting insights that we developed out of the military academy, but which is now being rolled out across the soldier academy, is the sense of a critical mass, i.e. it's a cohort. You need to get to almost 30% of any given, whether it's a section, a platoon, or a unit of whatever description. You need to get to 30% or so before the culture changes from within. Now, in a very, very heavily gendered organisation like the Army, where we are 90% men and 10% women, as the Army Service Women's Network tells me, we cannot change it on our own. And they're quite right. 10% cannot bring about these changes. So there is something here around where there are interventions that you can create these cohorts as an end in themselves, but also as a catalyst for leadership and role modelling, and encouraging the service men to join in as
units, if you like, with the critical mass that then can spread the word, something like that.
Yeah, so you start to get into there are some units where it happens very naturally. So in the Army Medical Services, for example, you will see very, very equitable balance of men and women in the units. And you can correlate that with concerns and issues and culture and behaviours and expectations and aspirations. So in some units it's easier than others. I think there is a degree of letting personal choice for Army service women go to where they want to go to serve. So we could, in theory, really encourage service in particular infantry units where there isn't a representation. But if they don't want to be there in the first place, they didn't necessarily want to join the infantry, or if they did want to join the infantry, they didn't necessarily want to join that unit. Forcing them to go there may end up being counterproductive. So I think this is one of those where they go where they want to go because that's how they want to serve the nation. And we should respect their advice and judgment. We need to make it easy for service women, if they join Unit X, that actually mid-career or in the early stages they can transfer. And I had a fantastic testimonial from a sergeant who had transferred into the infantry and is now a platoon sergeant of a very, very tough infantry regiment. And a remarkable example of where people at the different stages in their career will find their niche and they'll find their calling, and we need to make it as easy as possible for them to go to where they feel they can best serve.
Thank you. And are there interventions that you've tried that haven't worked?
And I come back on the very specifics, because the danger is I will ad-lib that, but I will come back to you on the very specific. There will be undoubtedly things we have tried which have not had the desired result. It may have been the right thing, but we did it in the wrong way. And there may well be things that we did with the very best intentions, but actually turned out to be the wrong thing.
Or a learning organisation. You're going to try some stuff. It might work. It might not work.
Couldn't conclude it in the better way. That's what we're trying. That's what we're trying to do. Final one. Sorry, just to reiterate what I said. Well, please understand what we're trying to do with human performance optimization. It is astonishing when you are led by the science and the data, not the anecdotes.
Okay, thank you. Sam, did you have something you want to comment on?
So I guess just a couple of numbers that might be helpful. So in terms of wraparound childcare, that has been a real positive for our men as well as our women. I think we estimate there's sort of about 10,300 families, I believe, impacted by that, and that undoubtedly we know across all of society the importance of that. Flexible working as well, we've seen quite a large proportion of women taking up those opportunities. So there's some really important stuff there. We mentioned the science of human performance, and sometimes perhaps for some of our women, it's one of those things that they might be a bit more nervous about. And while this isn't a finalised copy, I have a draft copy of our Science of Human Performance, a guide for service women preparing for arduous training, which is based on that sort of 10 years of fantastic science work by Professor Judy Greaves. it is always going to be more challenging for our service women to meet certain tests or achieve certain things if they don't understand their own physiology and whether the vitamins that might be most useful for them, the way they might address menstrual cycles, all of these sorts of points. So actually I think we've got some fantastic world-leading in places data that is going to better enable our women to be able to achieve some of those things where perhaps they'd had their hands slightly tied behind their backs. And my only other point that I'd just recommend to you, apologies, I haven't killed too many trees by printing some, but the Women in Defence organisation does a fantastic annual review of the sort of changing face of defence. It talks about the critical mass point. It looks at it through the lens of industry as well. So industry, I think, has reached pretty much 30%, but is probably stagnating a little bit in the current environment. What it is really focused on this last year is women in decision-making roles, because actually where do we want that challenge? Where do we want that differential of thinking? We really want it in some of those leadership roles, and that will then have an impact on culture more broadly. And there's some really positive and interesting insight there about the change over the last 5 years where we are seeing women's voices at the top decision-making table. So I would recommend it's online as well.
Thanks. I think I've got a minute left. Harv, you've been waving your arms. Did you want to say something on this quickly?
I think broadly in the round, in terms of what interventions are we making, and that's informing people to want to stay longer. The two words I would use is trust and opportunity. Many interventions are building trust with all of our team, not just the women cohort, that we are listening, that we are seeing, and that we are acting. And that's incredibly important. In the Air Force, one of the constant criticism feedback we've had is it takes too long to close out a case. When someone raises a complaint, it's taking way too long to close it out. We have redeveloped how we do that, and where previously the average was an 8-month for a good run at it. Now we're through a slicker process, better education. We're achieving that in less than 35 days, and actually that trend's coming down. Again, that's good. People want to know if they're going to make a complaint, it needs to be acted on and closed out quickly, and not drifting on and on and on like a sore wound.
Okay. Yeah. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. On to Derek Toy.
Right, thank you, Chair. Minister, if I could ask you first, the MOD's made claims about building trust in the service complaints system. Can you describe to the committee how you can prove that's the case?
So we've taken a number of steps to improve trust in that. I think really crucially is the Tri-Service Complaints Unit, which is taking the serious allegations to do with harassment and bullying, etc., and taking that into the tri-service space so we can ensure consistency across the services. So that we can see that we are truly applying a standard that an outsider or a victim can look at and know is there for them. We've also stood up the Victim and Witness Care Unit, which is primarily if you have been the victim of unacceptable behaviour or criminal acts, you can reach out to it. You don't need to have reported it. You don't have to have told anybody else about it. You can reach out to this unit and you will be supported and you will be given that help. And I think that unit is incredibly powerful because it's something that you can go to as a victim when you're in the first stages of processing what has happened to you. And I know for many victims that they are very worried about coming forwards and the consequences of what that might be, but they're still in desperate need of support. And so having something where they can go to and be given that support, be able to talk through their issues, I think will help them understand if they wish to formally report where the options are and where they can go from that. There's also, I know you've asked specifically about the service complaints. I think as well we should note how important it is that we now have our Armed Forces Commissioner, Polly Perkins, in, and to know that we have someone who's independent, who's very well respected, who'll be able to come in and do that role. I think is a real signal. We can talk about the practical implications of having that role, but the fact that we now have one is huge.
Okay, well, that's interesting that you're describing what you're doing. I think my question specifically was, what proof do you have that confidence has increased and is increasing in the service complaints?
That's an interesting one. So I'll come back to you if we've tracked that specifically. I think one thing is...
That's what if you don't mind, that's clearly what we're interested in, is how is, because you can put all the systems in place, but what we need to know, if that confidence, that people feel confidence in using the system, what proof do you have to back up the system that the satisfaction is increasing or people are more comfortable and confident in using it?
So I think obviously in terms of service complaints, most of the sort of chunky changes we introduced back in 2022 about taking the single service sort of direct chain of command out of those cases, introducing more independent folk in terms of the investigation, in terms of decision-making panels, etc. And I think what we have seen over the last 3 years is about a 74% increase in complaints being made. And I recall, I think with the previous committee, Mariette Hughes as SCOAF reflected that she thought, and I've got to make sure I quote her correctly, but I think her comments were she wasn't seeing anything which was telling her that the culture is getting worse, rather that people have better access. I think in each of her reports over the last few years, she has identified significant improvements. I'm conscious that the timing of this hearing is always doesn't cross over very neatly, but her next report I think will be really interesting on that.
You see what we're getting at? We're looking for credible evidence and data that confidence, making complaints is one thing, but actually being satisfied that it's been dealt with in a way that's proper, and what I'm not hearing is any evidence that is happening at the moment.
So I think that if you were to read the last few reports from the Service Complaints Ombudsman, she has identified improvements in the system. Her next one will come out very shortly, and that will probably be the one that will.
And it's all about the system. What I'm hearing is that you haven't actually got any proof of evidence that this confidence has increased with the way service complaints are being dealt with.
So I think the increase in complaints is an indicator. I think it is for the independent SCOAF to opine on those views, and we shall see that report shortly.
Yeah, and the RAF Families Federation suggested we need to revisit the recommendations for an independent defence authority. Do you agree?
So I think, I'll always look at suggestions and recommendations and bottom that out. So my question is, without solutioneering, what is the real focus that they're trying to get after that? Yeah. Are they putting forwards that it's about there's concerns about the independence of the scrutiny of our system? I think we can point to measures that we've got to ensure that we are doing that. Yeah. And I would also say there's that route you can go down, but we've obviously got an Armed Force Commissioner now, so I would say that there's a conversation that's ongoing. I wouldn't say necessarily that is jumping out as speaking for itself as something that we need right now.
Yeah. Can I ask each of the service chiefs, because you mentioned statistics on a number of issues, in terms of the key performance indicators of service complaints being dealt with, or 90% being dealt with in a certain time frame, how's that target going in terms of service complaints being dealt with in the time frame that you've already agreed to? We start with the Chief Marshal. What you're hitting at the moment in terms of the timescale? So 24. I think it's 24 weeks, if I recall.
Yeah. The stats are showing that we are making a gentle improvement.
So what's the current figure then?
I don't have that current figure, but I will get it for you. But we are making a gentle improvement. It could be better.
Well, you haven't got the figure.
I'll get back to you on that.
General Jenkins,
so we are waiting for this next report to tell you what these figures are going to look like.
What was the last figures that you had?
I don't have those available to me.
General Walker.
61% hit the timeline.
So you're 61. And that was which year? We were talking about 24 or 25? 25. So why is it the RAF and the Navy don't know these figures?
Because I've got my aide behind me who's helping me answer with the evidence so that you can get it now rather than coming back to it later.
You're obviously not
prepared. I think prepared. Sam may have this.
The reason I asked this question is important because we one of the things that came out of the Atherton report is that the leadership from the top is crucial to turning this around. Yeah. And we need to be assured that you, as the heads of service, are actually on top of the data and on top of the information here. And that's why I was asking the question, not to try and trip you up, but to see how well you're on top of the data. Because, you know, if you're really going to lead from the front and make the changes that you've already alluded to, we need to understand this, and that's the reason for asking that question. Sorry, Sam.
Sorry, I was going to say, so page 23 of the evidence that we submitted has
that
the summary
was the 24.
from...
That was the 20.
The 24, yes.
Yeah,
so
24.
The 25 report we expect out in the next
you don't
few
have the
weeks.
25 figures to hand now.
No, so they're owned by the independent SCOAF, so we have to be slightly wary of, we can't, it's for the SCOAF to sort of articulate those figures in her report as the independent check. So it's that slightly awkward thing of the SCOAF has to tell you, if you see what I mean, in her report, which will come out shortly.
Thank you. I think that Director has made some very, very pertinent points. Minister, I think it needs to be noted that according to the Armed Forces Continuous Attitude Survey 2025, 86% of those subjected to bullying or harassment, they actually don't make a complaint. So therefore, there is something inherently wrong where people do not feel confident enough to make that complaint. So how are you going to change that?
Yeah, and I think that's an important point, because there's two distinct stages, isn't there, when you've been the victim of unacceptable behaviour. There's the system that kicks in when something is reported, and I think we can point to a lot of things that we've done to improve the system when it is reported. What the worry for me is when things aren't reported or very, very informally reported. And there's a whole number of different factors there. I think something that we are doing that I think will actually have a powerful impact on that is we have the pilots of our Violence Against Women and Girls Prevention Task Forces, because I think there's a real education gap. A lot of people in the military are very, very young, very young. A lot of them will be under 25. And they don't necessarily recognise or understand when they have been subject to unacceptable behaviour. Certainly I didn't when I was at the beginning of my career. When I look back now, I can say, well, actually that was unacceptable, and you know, X, Y, and Z should have happened, and I can point back to the reasons why I didn't say anything or whatever. And I think therefore the education for people when they're starting their military careers to say these are the kind of things that are unacceptable, and it feels really counterintuitive. You think somebody would recognise when they're being bullied, when they're being harassed, or when they've been subject to unacceptable behaviour, but actually it's not always the case at all. I think so. Therefore, the education part of people going through training is hugely important. There'll be a number of other factors that mean that people aren't coming forwards. One thing that I would hate to see, and I don't have the data to know how big a factor this, but I would hate to see it's because somebody doesn't have confidence that their complaint won't be taken seriously, and I would hate to see if that was the case. And I think that is something that is within our power to really strongly target.
Right. Let's move on to Michelle Scroggum.
Thank you, Chair. Last year when we had all three chiefs in front of this committee, I asked a really simple question, and it was, are women in the armed forces as safe as they would be in civilian life? And I didn't get a single yes or no response. Nobody would answer the question. I will again put that to all three chiefs, and like to see a definitive answer to that, whether it's a yes or no.
I'll start. Can you say exactly the question?
Do you think women in the armed forces are as safe as they would be in civilian life? When it
Do I
comes
what?
to,
Sorry.
do you think women in the armed forces... Yes.
Yeah. Objectively, yes. Because of the policies, the framework, the extraordinary effort that we go to take civilians through a recruiting and application process, imprinting on them values and standards that are not necessarily what they would have been brought up with or would be a frame of reference in the life that they would otherwise lead. That, I think, is very different to their colleagues in other civilian sectors. So there is a point of difference. The way we train them, the way we build teams, the way we live together, the way we work together, the way we have our own independent justice system, the way we have our own independent approach to complaints, all of that represents the safeguards and the guardrails to protect our people from predators, perpetrators, and ne'er-do-wells. So objectively, I think we have a very, very safe system. But people make choices. You know that. We know that. The important thing is when people make the wrong choice, and people are wronged, they have got a way of having their voice heard. And that action is taken decisively and for the encouragement of better behaviour by others. So I would say in that framework, we've got a very, very robust, extraordinarily resilient, and something we should be very, very proud of. 96% of soldiers and officers come to work every year and don't commit any offence or have any allegation of crime or mistreatment or anything. So 4% of offences are carried out by, only 4% of the offence. So of all the offences, only 4% come from, only 4% of the army are responsible. So the vast, vast majority of people will have a fulfilling, safe, respectful career. We have to recognise people made choices, and that's what our system is guarding against.
Thank you. General Jenkins, if I can ask the same of yourself.
Yeah, I agree. I agree entirely with CGS. I think as an organisation, the Armed Forces and the Navy, in my sense, has a phenomenal amount of regulation, training, education, support, checks and balances in place that we wouldn't see in much of the civilian sector at all. Right from the beginning of training, we educate young people on the standards and the culture that we expect them to live within, and then we do that at every level of command as they progress throughout their career. I think that has got to be a gold standard of how you inculcate people into the very high standards that we expect people to conduct within, to live within the armed forces. The question you ask is it's a relative question in terms of which bit of the civilian sector, which bit of the armed forces in what conditions. But what we can assure you is that as an organisation that willingly invites scrutiny and challenge to the way that we look after our people and keep them safe, and then imposes policy and practice, education and training in order to make sure that that policy is carried out, I think we should take a lot of comfort from that. But in the relative sense of the question, is there still room for improvement? Of course there's room for improvement. Of course we will continue to take the actions that are required in order to keep our people as safe as possible, even in the difficult circumstances that we sometimes operate in and the environment that we put them in. As I said in my introduction at the beginning, I think this is the moral obligation of us as defence leaders, which is these people volunteer for service and put themselves in harm's way in order to protect this country. What we should do is protect them. So the simple answer to the question is yes.
I think it's differentiating specifically between the armed forces and civilian life that I was interested in. Are they more at risk within the armed forces? I take you mean. Chief Marshal.
I think it's all been said. To be honest, I'm in exactly the same position as my two colleagues. Are we aware of the issues? Yes. Do we put robust mechanisms in place? Yes. Do we constantly test those? Yes. Are we working to reduce any risk, be that real or perceived, to as low as possible? Yes, we are. I think for me, perhaps the litmus test question is, as the dad of two daughters, would I recommend to either of them to join the service? And the answer to that is yes. In fact, one of them works down the street in the MOD. So I'm completely aligned with my two service chiefs.
Thank you. Brave choice, given that that's been listed as one of the worst and most toxic places to work for women. I would love to have a conversation about her experiences on that. But to move on, why is sexual harassment as prevalent as it was 5 years ago, with all of those things in place and all of those changes that we are making and that you're saying that you're doing within the forces? Why is it still as prevalent now as it was 5 years ago when we got the Atherton report? And again, I will put that to the chiefs.
I think there is, and I haven't got the data to hand, but I think is when I was first briefed on the level of sexualization in young people in society, the level of exposure to drugs, drink, alcohol, and violence in wider society, it is not a surprise to me that when we take 10,000 civilians, generally between the ages of 17 and a half and 20, and train them to be soldiers, that in those early weeks and months of onboarding them into our organisation, we see the greatest correlation of behaviours which are at odds with our values and standards. But the story is one of transformation, I would say.
It's not that if we're still getting the same numbers 5 years after this report came out, that hasn't changed. So clearly whatever we're doing, whether that's right at the start when people are coming in, it's not enough because nothing has changed in 5 years when it comes to...
My personal view is this gets harder before it gets easier because of the trends in wider society, which you will be very aware of. So the level of misogyny, the level of rancorous behaviour or sort of rancorous sort of belief systems, the tension in wider society, I think is something we have to accept is the environment from which we attract people. People are drawn to the armed service because they want to be something different, and it takes a while to transform them from being civilians, in my case, into being soldiers. And that is a journey. It is not a cliff edge where you walk in the door and suddenly you're a different person. These have got to be learned behaviours and applied, and the guardrails that I covered in my first answer to your question, the guardrails are there to do that, to do the very best for our people so they can do the best for the nation.
Do you think the guardrails need strengthening if it's still happening in those very early days? If we're throwing in a mix of younger recruits with a mix of vulnerable young women, what if we understand that is where there's a big risk? Why are we still doing it?
So I think there's a high degree of vulnerability everywhere rather than just in specific genders. I do think there is a big burden we put on our junior leaders who are the instructors, and I think there is increasing recognition that they deserve support as they increasingly start the journey of taking civilians who want to be soldiers and bringing them into that moral and ethic framing of what it means to be a soldier in the 21st century and what soldiering entails, is we can provide more support and preparation for them, which is why in many ways in the Army specifically we have established the Soldier Academy and why we've established the NCO Academy. That's why I'm very proud that the Army Sergeant Major has just published the NCO Creed, which is a very clear articulation of what it means to be a junior leader in this army today and what is expected of them. And all of that, I think, is to equip them with that junior level leadership responsibility for our most inexperienced soldiers, but ultimately, who will bear the greatest risk in combat? Because it's on their shoulders that battles will be won or lost.
Are you aware of how many in those early positions of leadership have been fired for wrongdoing, for sexual misconduct?
Yeah, 8.
Okay, so we clearly, it's not just the people that are coming in at the lower level ranks that haven't had the training to understand what's wrong and what's not.
Which is why they're discharged.
People in positions of power.
Where they're in a position, yeah.
I'm going to move on to General Jenkins, if I may.
So at least part of the picture here is that there is increasing confidence in people's willingness and trust in reporting unacceptable behaviour. So I don't think we're looking at a level playing field in that sense, and we continue to see those numbers rise. At the moment, we would assess that is a good thing, that our processes are generating more confidence in our communities to raise issues as they see, that our education programs are working in terms of allowing people to objectively understand what is unacceptable in the context of the culture that we want to create, and that is resulting in more reporting. What we should see over time is those figures should start to plateau, that we build transparent, easy-to-use processes that enable people to raise concerns without fear of criticism or censure in some way, and that then that enables us to understand what the real picture is within our communities. So I think what we would see is these figures should actually continue to rise for some time, and then we can have the discussion about, okay, then what is the real baseline here, and how can we reduce that?
Thank you. In the interest of time, I'd just like to ask the Minister, what are your priorities on seeing the survey from last year on sexualised behaviours?
Yeah, so it comes back to the point I've talked about. First off is taking a systems approach to this, so that there are multiple levels where if something unacceptable has happened, that it can be caught by the system and then processed appropriately. I think we have seen where that hasn't always been the case. We can't have single points of failure in this system. And the second point really comes to, as I said, bridging the gap so that people feel that they can come forwards and report what has happened to them, regardless of the severity, that there are different paths, that they feel that they are being listened to, but really crucially that they don't feel that the consequences for the perpetrator are on them either, because I do think that is a big thing that stops some people coming forwards. And so for me, it's about, I've talked about the prevention task force that we're running and how that's focused on where we have some of our recruits. And I think that's a really crucial part. But when we come and talk about culture, and I think culture does take a long time, and I think it comes to your point about it not having changed by that metric in 5 years. Culture does take a long time to change. We know how important junior NCOs are in setting that culture. And I can point to things that we've put into place where I think it is too soon to have seen them have that impact. I said earlier, I'm always somebody who wants to go further and always wants to be able to go faster. But it's about having that accountability. And I think it's about recognising what's really great in the military. We build really tight teams, really strong teams. And I can point to where I was really supported by my male colleagues and really looked after and treated really well. And we just have to recognise how when behaviour just falls short of standards, the pressures that people might feel under to not report something. Mm-hmm. And we really have to take that into account. And I do think it can be frustrating, as the heart of that is the education part. We've talked about the kind of people we take into the military. We take them from a wide range of backgrounds, and we take people into the military who might have been subject to abuse themselves, who might not know or recognise the standards that we need to set. There's lots of discussions going on about,
I do understand that was
sorry.
the point I made earlier.
So,
that we're putting people in a known situation of risk. What more would you? What are your priorities and what we need to do to change? If it could be really brief. Yeah.
So education of people when they come in, so that they can recognise competence in the system, so that they can recognise and understand the full range of options that are available to them. And I don't think I could just stop a member of the armed forces in the street and they would know all the options available to them. Certainly I didn't when I was serving. Those two things.
Thank you.
Brilliant, thank you very much. A very quick supplementary from Fred Thomas.
It will be, thank you, Chair. General Walker, we know that one of your main concerns is recruit and retain. And you mentioned there, and I just want to ask you further about it, that your sense is that there is various rancorous belief systems in wider society.
There are.
This is what you just said, I think.
Yeah.
Rancorous.
Rancorous, yes.
Rancorous belief systems in wider society. Yeah. In the context of women in the armed forces, and also wider, with the type of person you are managing to get in through the door, what do you mean by rancorous belief systems in wider society, and how does it affect the army?
I've got sort of children in their early 20s, so I'm well aware of and have done my own sort of work of understanding just what's going on with things like the manosphere, the sense of sort of deepening risk within young people, all of which is playing through, accelerated through social media. So that sort of environment is to my mind the and that's for all of us. I mean, that's all of our children are growing up in that world, and that's a sort of parental responsibility to understand the environment. But also, what I recognise is that a lot of that generation are coming through into the armed forces. So we had a fascinating, for me, maybe not for you, but board-level discussion with all our non-executives and all the senior leaders of the Army, which understood what could our role be as an example of where we take anyone from anywhere, irrespective of their gender, their identity, their orientation, or anything. and we bring them together. It's this extraordinary organisation where they become soldiers and they are prepared to put their lives down for the sake of other people. That's not a natural thing for people to want to do, but they are drawn to it. So there is something in it here where I think we are an example of what it could be. And what we looked at outside of the environment is it looks like it's going it's in the other direction. And we may well be an example to show what an integrated organisation that puts purpose and vision to the fore, and that's our value proposition, not just as a fighting force that can fight and win the nation's battles. That's what you pay us to do, that's what we'll do every single day, we'll do. But actually, what more can we do to, in the theme of the SDR, reconnect with the society which we represent, which we need to draw our depth from, and which we need to be as resilient as possible. And I'm brought back persistently to things like the cadet schemes and the impact it has on lives and other areas. And my view is we need to be doing more of that stuff because of the impact it has on society. It's just positive.
Thank you very much. All right, let's move on to Calvin Bailey, please.
Thanks very much, Chair. 7% of the force roughly come from ethnic minority backgrounds, and yet they're significantly overrepresented in the stats that we see for women and complaints, and yet we know that most of the complaints never surface. So what is the department, perhaps Sam, doing to address racism as well as sexism?
So particularly in the service complaint space, we've been doing quite a lot of work with SCOAF, now Armed Forces Commissioner, to look at to review those, to get some independent review of those cases, to try and better understand some of the underlying pieces, see if there are things that we can change in terms of process to better support. Again, I until the SCOAF/Armed Forces Commissioner's report is laid in the coming weeks. I'm conscious I can't comment on that because she will be providing an independent view on how successful or otherwise there are. But there has been a great deal of work jointly with the Service Complaints Ombudsman to both understand the root causes of that and then drive some changes in there. Apologies if I'm being slightly hesitant. I'm just conscious it's the SCOAF story to tell as opposed.
We're 5 years in, aren't we? So
yeah,
there should be something to tell, right?
Yeah. Yes.
So what is that?
I'm trying to tread carefully that I'm not saying what the SCOAF might say shortly, but there has been significant work in terms of review across those cases, understanding why there was that over-representation. Are there mechanisms that can be put in place, and then putting those in place, including through some of the dip sampling and assurance processes as well.
Okay, so the dip sampling is trying to get after the unheard complaints.
And equally having an independent review of cases that are particularly associated with folk from the global majority or folk from women's
ethnic minority backgrounds.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, I'm just hesitant to say more detail because I think that detail might be coming out from the SCOAF.
Okay, and what other support are you providing to the service chiefs in terms of, say, networks and the likes to try and get to those people and hear their voices?
So we've got some fantastic service networks, our multicultural networks, etc. And I think service chiefs have been involved in talking with them in the various conferences they've put in. They've also fed into each service has got an armed forces. I can't remember you might use slightly different language for them, but kind of race action plans as well, which the chiefs might be able to speak better to in terms of the work they're doing on that front.
Okay, Marshal, Air Chief Marshal Harv, do you want to offer some tangible examples, perhaps?
I mean, I think exactly as Sam says, the mechanisms are in place. From my perspective, this is about how we overtly communicate about it. You've highlighted the stats there, which frankly are still unacceptable. We as service chiefs must be communicating very clearly about this with our people across the breadth of the service, that there's no place for it in our services. And all the mechanisms are in place for people to report it. It comes back to my comments earlier around building trust for our people, that they know what the mechanisms are, and that when they are brave enough to come forward and report it, that it will be listened to and dealt with and acted upon swiftly. That's one of the, I've said this earlier, it's one of the biggest criticisms I get from both females and ethnic minorities is when I say, well, did you report it? They'll share with me, and you know me well, I'm very open door. Lots of people come to talk to me individually about different experiences they've had. And my first question is generally, have you reported it, and where are we in the process, and do you need my help to push that through? And when people say, well, I've not reported it because my experience is it'll just go nowhere, or it might impact my career, or I have no trust in the system, that's the bit where we as service chiefs have to work harder to pull that through and fix it.
Okay. General Surveyor?
Yeah, I'd really commend, you've referred to them, these networks. A lot of these are bottom-up, organic, they've grown. This to me is evidence of when you get peer pressure beginning to change from within and from below, and it's much more powerful for them, very well, and it supports very well intention, top-down direction and policy. So it makes it real. I really commend the Army's multicultural network. We had an absolutely tremendous day at Sandhurst. Likewise, I would commend the Army Service Network. So again, if there is ever time for you as a committee to go and hear from them rather than me parroting their good work, what I would have said in my remarks is I give them all the credit for all of the understanding that I have of and the depth of feeling that we have on this. So I would say that's a really powerful network. We are refreshing version 2 of the Race Action Plan. We are, as a consequence of the first version of the Race Action Plan, coming up with the Gender Action Plan as well. All of these will result in structural changes, not just words.
Brilliant, thank you, and we'll take you up on that offer for completeness. Sorry, first.
So I'd briefly, please. Yeah, I'd echo the point on the networks. Of course, at the heart of this, we have to recruit more minority groups into the armed forces. We have to get these percentages up for all the reasons I outlined in my introduction, for what makes better teams for us to solve our problems. And we continue to be challenged to access those communities and convince them that we are offering a fulfilling, safe, exciting career opportunities in the armed forces. I think that is beholden on us to demonstrate that that is true, and the networks have an important part to play in that, because ultimately this changes by shifting the percentage of balance within our armed forces, and we've got to show what is true, which is we can provide a safe environment for people to come and join the armed forces, regardless of their background or gender.
Thanks very much. We'll take you up on the invites to meet the networks.
Definitely. Much appreciated. On to Emma Lill, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. My question's directed to yourself, General Walker. It's around the Army Foundation College at Harrogate, where junior soldiers, 16 to 18-year-old children are trained. Now, we as a committee have visited the college, so my line of questioning today is no reflection on the impressive young people we met there or the staff there. But you know as well that time and time again we keep hearing that things there are improving for young female recruits, yet recent data shows that between 2021 and 2024 there have been 122 investigations into sexual offences against under 18-year-olds, 80 of which are sexual assault. We don't know how many were on young female recruits because the MOD refuses to break those figures down for us. North Yorkshire Council in the last 5 years has received 89 safeguarding notifications concerning staff at the college, and the Centre for Military of Justice have recently said they are not confident that young women or children are safe at that college. So, General Walker, could you talk me through, if I was a young female at the college and I had been sexually abused or sexually assaulted, what would I do? What would the process for me be?
Thank you, and thank you for going to visit. And it was an offer I made to the rest of the committee, and those that did go, I'm really grateful that you did, because you've got to see it to believe it, and you've got to hear it from those testimonies. And I'm very glad that you also recognise the extraordinary young people we have there and the effort that's been going to prepare them. So I think this does bridge to the previous question from Michelle, which is actually, and both that I follow up with Fred, which is really around recognising the challenge I think a lot of young people have when they join the military and are confronted with these very high standards of behaviour and the values that we expect of them as soldiers throughout their career. And to me, it's that is proving the point. The prevalence of sexualized behavior, of inappropriate behavior, of unwanted attention, I think bears that point out. That's why we have such a strict...
I wish to interrupt you, General Walker, but some of these, the safeguard notifications were concerning staff at the college. So that wasn't young people, that was staff at the college. And I think what I'm trying to get to the nub of is the data doesn't bear out that things have improved there. And if I was a young woman studying or training at the college, what would I do if I was sexually abused or sexually assaulted there? Where would I go for help? Who could I talk to? I'm just interested if the General knows, because the General, it's
let's
the General's
be very clear.
remit. So,
you go to the police.
and
Absolutely.
how would I do that? Can I leave whenever I want? Can I walk out whenever I want?
You can call a helpline, you can walk out as part of a policy, you can report it to...
So what does walk out as part of a policy mean?
You can literally walk out that college if you're not in a lesson, if you're not under structured training, then you can call 999. Yeah. There are helplines all over the place. There are hotlines and anonymous tips. There are welfare staff who are there. There are instructors. But if it's clearly your instructor that's done it.
Is it a private phone? Or are these phones all in public domains? Because my understanding is that initially when you join the college, you can't leave for a number of days, and that you're restricted when you are allowed your mobile phone. So again, my point is, where would I go and what would I do if I had been sexually assaulted and I desperately needed help?
What mean? Yes. So okay. So this is in the very, very early stages where you're trying to get that sense of teamwork and cohort going. So this is where that college has, because it is an educational establishment and it has been checked by Ofsted repeatedly, and you and I can go through reports of excellent reports from Ofsted as well as from North Yorkshire Council, is making sure that we've got the safeguarding that would apply in any other residential educational establishment that is possible there, and very high levels of welfare staff and safeguarding staff. So there are outlets there. If young people don't know that, then that's on us for not educating them that these are their outlets.
I think just the Ofsted process is slightly different for yourselves than I'm an ex-children's social worker, so I know what these inspections look like, and I would say the inspections that have been held at the college are very different to those that would be at any other residential establishment for children. So just to point that out, what is it, General, that you're trying to do? What actions are you going to take to make sure that the stats that I've just read out there, next time we're reviewing this, aren't the same? In that,
thank you. Yeah. So
and that you're not getting comments like children are not safe there from outside organisations.
Everything is reported to the police if there is any sense that a crime has been committed in British in English.
And law. As a young person, I could do that myself because again, sorry, I know I'm going back, but my understanding is in the initial phase, you cannot just leave. You don't have access to your mobile phone all the time. So again, how would I report that to the police? Would I have to stand in a corridor on a phone and tell where everyone can walk past and hear what's happened to me? Yeah. I'm just trying to figure out how this actually works in reality.
There are welfare teams, there are members of staff, there are trainers, there are people in positions of authority who they can go into and are trained and responsible to direct them to the right place. So
89 of the referrals to North Yorkshire Safeguarding are about staff. So again, if I couldn't go to those staff because it was one of those staff,
they were
for
referred.
example,
Sorry, forgive me. They were referred. They were able to hear their voice was heard. They were reported to the
how
appropriate
long down
authorities.
the line? Because again, the data that we request from MOD is not forthcoming on this. So how long down the line? Had they been repeated to further abuse before it eventually got reported? We don't know.
Let me see.
I mean, these are children.
Let me see
general.
what through
These are
exactly
children.
through data protection and freedom of information, what we can get there. So I understand the. Sorry, forgive me. I understand where you're getting at. I think there are very clear signposts for how young people, if they are feel unsafe, vulnerable, or have been attacked, about who they can go to and who they can report it to. The evidence of the referrals tells me that it does work. Now, the counterfactual is, which ones do we not know about? These are the ones that we do know about. When it comes to the, as answered in the previous question, of discharges of where instructors have been abusive or violent or have committed the crimes, then of course the zero tolerance policy on unacceptable sexual behaviour applies, and they will have been discharged as right. There is no mitigation in that particular context. So my sort of summary on it is, let me come back on the very specifics of how long did it take from the complaint and were there any obstacles to those complaints reaching the authorities? And let me try and work that out for you.
I don't want to hog any more time, General Walker, but I'm not convinced that if something had happened to me of a sexual abusive nature as a young recruit in that college, that I would know where to go and I would have the confidence to go to somebody. And I'm just wondering, do you not feel there's a two-tier system here compared to other residential colleges? And is it not perhaps time the Children's Commissioner came and did a thorough visit and had a chat to some of the young soldiers there?
Please do. I really encourage you and the panel to spend as much time with those soldiers as possible. That is your right, and actually it is. I think it is. In part your terms of reference here.
I was referring to the Children's Commissioner. I was referring to the Children's Commissioner, who has statutory rights, who would visit any other residential college. I think it would be good if she could make a visit. Yeah, because it does look like there's a two-tier system for the military college compared to other residential colleges for children.
I defer to your expertise.
And the
there,
safeguarding alerts in those other residential colleges are nowhere near as high as this. But I don't want to hog time, Chair. I just think it's important to put that down.
Is it possible just to add a couple of really practical things? You mentioned making phone calls in sort of public areas. If I can just, so the Victim and Witness Care Unit, I know you met some colleagues on the visit. If I can just read out the email address so they wouldn't have to speak in a corridor if they wanted to email them to make some of that initial contact, which is people-dscc- VWCU group at mod.gov.uk, so people-DSCC-VWCU group at mod.gov.uk to make some of that connections. It's also available on the external government website.
Sorry to interrupt you, Sam. I don't want to go around in circles, but would they have access to a computer? I mean, we could go on all day. I think I'm just trying to get to the practicalities of it, and there's clearly something not right. The data doesn't back up. There's something clearly going awry at the college, because time and time again, there's this many alerts. I think that's the point I'm trying to make, is that there's something not right and it needs looking at.
Agreed, General. I did raise this specifically with you during this last session on women in the armed forces. You might recall our exchange, and I agree with my colleague Emilio, having visited when we went to AFC Harrogate. There are issues that need to be gotten into, and I think we are still in a very unsatisfactory situation. But look, given the time, and there's still a lot of ground to cover, I wanted to just come on to yourself, Minister. With respect to sexual offences and domestic abuse, the numbers of investigations which are being dealt with within the service justice system, they're actually rising, but the problem is that judicial outcomes are still very limited. So what should victims take away from this situation?
First of all, I would just say, I understand from what you're saying, you're kind of thinking in comparison to the civilian justice system. Is that right, what you were
so basically what I'm saying is that the number of investigations are rising, but the outcomes are very, very limited. So, there's a problem there, wouldn't you not say?
I think, I think we've avoid sort of making an arbitrary thing that says, if an investigation doesn't result in a conviction, it hasn't done its job properly. One of the ways that we try and understand, okay, have we got the right levels of convictions, is we would potentially look at other systems. It's not always quite correct to compare the civilian justice system and the service justice system from that point of view. I think this is an aspect actually that we don't talk about as much when we're talking about these topics, actually domestic abuse within the forces. And I think it poses a lot of challenges. I mean, I can point to some of the work that we're doing with the Armed Forces Bill to improve the range of protections and orders that our service justice system is able to make to protect those victims. And I think really crucially it's about making sure we've got the victim-centred approach here as well. And we can point to the steps that we're taking to improve that. I think in the country as a whole, when we look at domestic abuse, it can be incredibly frustrating when we see the outcomes, when we see the testimonies. And then again, it's frustrating for me to see that the service has been the victim of something like this. Just go to the police. What I do find concerning or frustrating is where allegations are being made and they aren't being made to the police, but they're not being referred to the police either. That's why we're doing things like expanding the duty on anybody with a command duty when they hear an allegation of that kind, that they have that duty to report it to the police if they believe it hasn't already been done so. I think it comes back to kind of a theme which I just want to keep hitting throughout all of this is these really important two halves of this system. There's a system that kicks in when something is reported, but it's about getting people to be able to take that huge step of reporting and having confidence in the system. Having confidence that when they make a complaint that they'll be protected in the intermediate aftermath, that the complaint will be processed properly, taken into account. I think I can point to certain aspects of the service justice system that show that we are making huge strides forwards. Right. Since I was serving. So I completely take the point that you can make the case that we're still not where we should be, but I do honestly think that we are making serious strides forwards.
Thank you much. On to Derek Twigg.
Can I ask a specific question, which is a key reason for maintaining the jurisdiction of the service justice system in relation to serious sexual offences was its ability to operate overseas. However, the ORF Families Federation has told us that support and safeguarding for victims and witnesses overseas remain a significant vulnerability. Can I ask you what you're doing to address this, Minister?
If I turn to Sam, I mean, I could talk about the victim witness care unit.
Just touching on the earlier point about domestic abuse as well, the recently released stats that have just come out sort of show a 50% conviction rate of those in court martial for domestic abuse related matters, but it's so small it's impossible to compare to the civilian system. In terms of overseas, so one of the things that we're using the sexualised behaviours and sexual offending sexual harassment survey plus data from our Defence Serious Crime Unit has helped us identify areas where we want to go further. So the VORG task force, at the moment it's going to be focused around the Catterick area and the Plymouth areas where we are seeing higher risk, so therefore we're working to do more innovative work in those spaces. Equally, the second phase will be some of these overseas locations, so we're thinking about Cyprus as one of those areas where we want to do more work, both to understand the underlying causes, but also to test and adjust and use some more innovative approaches to it. I believe we are looking at providing further welfare support in there. I hesitate to say this in case I might be wrong, but I think there might be someone from Aurora New Dawn possibly that might be being involved in Cyprus as well.
Can I just get your sense, but given what the ORF Families Federation said, do you actually support the view that there remains a significant vulnerability?
I am not sure that there is a significant vulnerability.
Why do you think they said that then?
I'm not.
Spoken to them.
I'm not in their mind. I think what the Victim and Witness Care Unit provides support to folk in overseas locations. We've just opened, for example, in Germany, a new Victim Witness Suite. I think all feedback is really helpful, and I think actually that their concern about overseas locations is one that we share, hence targeting overseas locations for some of that early victim and witness care focus.
When will that be completed, that work with overseas locations?
So that's phase 2 of
might
our...
get some help there from...
Yeah.
As the general did before, we have put increased victim and witness care unit support is the same as we provide to folk in the UK. We are also putting independent sexual violence and DV support over in Cyprus. One of the things with this victim and witness care unit, the Violence Against Women and Girls Task Force is it is aiming to test and adjust some of the ideas from the broader cross-government violence against women and girls work. So I think that it is a known challenge which a lot of resource and effort is going into. That will involve the Families Federation at some point.
And I'm sure collected by the Armed Forces Commissioner.
Yeah. Can I just briefly come back to, it was mentioned earlier, but I want to come back to my earlier question. It comes from the Armed Forces Continuous Attitude Survey, which, as I say, was mentioned briefly. It says in the survey, of those who have experienced bullying, harassment or discrimination in the last 12 months, around 1 in 7 made a formal written complaint about their experience. And that's unchanged since 2023, which saw the proportion of personnel making a formal complaint almost double, returning to previously reported levels. So the point I'm making, however, the majority of personnel who have been subject to bullying, discrimination or harassment do not make a complaint. That's 86%. So again, I'm just coming back to this point I asked before about how can we, this committee, be confident that service personnel are confident in using the complaint system, other than there's been an increase in complaints, because obviously 86% did not make a complaint, even though they were subject to it. So I'm really still a bit of a loss to try and find what the MOD is doing to assure this committee that there's any evidence that confidence is increasing, because so far you've failed to be able to do that.
So I think the very fact that since we introduced those changes, taking the direct chain of command outside of those complaints, so they used to be dealt with just by the sort of the local commanding officers, we have definitely seen an increase. So we've made changes and we have seen an increase in those number of complaints.
With respect on the fiscal chairman's ones, but it's just we have not seen any evidence so far of that the confidence has risen. That's the point.
Yeah.
So I think the confidence to make a complaint is the highest on record in 2025.
Well, if you look at it, the number of people who didn't make a complaint.
But
we're seeing it increasing.
Okay.
I think relevant, just to go back to your sort of earlier question, in 2025, 51% of individuals who raised a service complaint said that they were happy with the objectivity and fairness with the handling of their complaint, which was an improvement of 13% compared to 2024. Obviously, 51% isn't good enough. And 44% were satisfied with the time taken, which is, I know, an increase from 26% in 2024, but again, it's a lower figure than it should be.
Okay. Right, brilliant. On to Fred Thomas.
Thank you, Chair. Just to move on to kind of broader culture within your various services. We've spoken mainly, of course, about women in the armed forces. That's this session's focus. We've also spoken about race. Can I ask about religion? I'll come to Navy, so General, to yourself first. We saw reports in mainstream media based off kind of reporting within a particular regimental magazine around massive increased uptake in Christianity this was about recruits in the Royal Marines and stories about baptisms happening on a Sunday in the Regain tank at Lympstone, which even as recently as 2016 when I was there, that wasn't happening. Church was empty on a Sunday. Apparently now you can't get in on a Sunday. It's so full, people got to rock up an hour early. That's the capacity. Are you tracking this at all in the Navy from the top down? Are you aware of this? Or?
No, I'm not.
Already
would be the short answer. I'm not tracking that specific circumstance.
Completely fair answer. Other services, you tracking Christianity, rise of Christianity at all? Is it something you get that reported to you at all?
Anecdotally, prayer groups, yes. It's always been strong in some communities, and where you've got where you have a sort of a cohort and it sustains itself. I haven't seen the figures coming through in terms of, I don't check church attendance or any of that. But so I have heard of it anecdotally.
Okay. Thank you.
Nothing beyond what we would consider normal. So definitely nothing to the specific of what you've mentioned.
I mean, I can a couple of things. So I attend a service church close to where I live, and I can't report a significant increase in attendance. It's healthy, but I haven't seen a particular surge. The chaplaincy continued to provide a really important function for us across the services, particularly for us, obviously, on deployed platforms, submarines and ships. They do provide a avenue outside of the chain of command for people to raise concerns and or seek their spiritual welfare, and I think that remains a really important offer that we make.
Absolutely, I'm
service that we provide.
It's the reporting we've had of things that are changing that I'm really interested in. But you've given good answers. Thank you, Minister. I just wondered if do you get reported to you when you're looking at people? Do you get religion and what's happening with religion in the forces? That regularly get reported to you or not?
No, and I just want to reiterate how important the chaplaincy service is. I'm not somebody with faith, but I really value the chaplaincy service and what they provide.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. Can I ask also about women in the Royal Marines, particularly because the Royal Marines are very overrepresented in Parliament, in government, in kind of top jobs in the MOD, compared to how much of a proportion of the armed forces the Royal Marines make up. So clearly, if we're talking about leadership roles and women in future leadership roles, having no women being regular Royal Marines commandos is probably a problem, in my view. That avenue's been open to women since 2018, I think. Currently, no women have been successful through the course to become a Royal Marines commando. Do you think that in the current state of play, without things being changed, that we will have women come through who do pass the full course as it is now?
Yes, I believe we will. I believe we can point to the success of women passing the All Arms Commando course as evidence that these tests are within capacity for females to pass. I think in many ways we have this sort of interesting scenario where we as the Navy will hold up the example of what the Royal Marines have done to try and make this as level a playing field as possible for women to join, both from expressions of interest through preparation for training, through the advocacy networks that we've established, through inviting others from across the services and from different countries as well to come and provide advice and support and mentorship for women candidates when they're beginning Royal Marines training. We have not had a successful candidate yet. I'm confident that we will get successful candidates pass those tests, and we're determined to make sure that is as smooth as it could possibly be, and then they can enjoy a fulfilling career within the Royal Marine Commandos once they're there.
Okay, thank you. Can I just come to yourself, Director, for the... did you want to comment on the religion question?
If it's okay.
Please do, yeah.
So we spent a lot of time with the chaplaincy and with the various faith and belief networks. I would say actually recently the Army has brought in its first non-religious chaplain as well, who's making a really positive difference to folk who might not follow a particular faith or belief system, and just giving optionality. I think also one of my other reflections in the current environment we're facing in the Middle East, the way our Jewish network and our Muslim networks have worked together to build understanding and to advise the department has actually been really outstanding. And just our Sikh network does fantastic stuff in terms of outreach and visibility. So I mean those are just a few examples of our Christian chaplains do fantastic work, but actually it's a broad church. But
I'm sure we're all very supportive of the chaplaincy service across all the services. I know I am personally from my time in service as well. I'm so short on time that I'm going to have to ask a separate question. I'm so sorry. General, in the Navy, I've heard anecdotally from serving Navy personnel, women, that life is okay ashore, so on naval bases in the UK mainland or abroad, but that at sea, it's a significantly different sketch. Do you recognise that characterisation? Does that reach you at all?
What I can say is that I think we have some best practice within the Royal Navy in terms of how we assess the climate and the culture that can be created on these on deployed platforms, ships and submarines. Our culture team is a team of experts who we can absolutely and do frequently fire into to assess the culture that a leadership team can create on a ship and make sure that that environment is where we would expect it to be, and then that enables us to take action if it's falling below the standards we would accept, and or where we see exceptional leadership and we see a thriving platform of deployed in any sense, we can then share that best practice across our piece. Much of what I've been doing since I arrived in the Navy to change the way that we assess our leaders is to put an emphasis on the climate that they can create within their teams. I would say within the Armed Forces, traditionally we have a top-down leadership assessment. You'll be familiar with this. Your ability to impress your first reporting officer is what dictates whether you can progress within your career. I'm absolutely determined within the Navy, and I know fellow chiefs share the same perspective, which is we've got to be assessing our leaders on the climate that they can create for their people. Back to what I said right at the start, we need high-performing teams to solve the most complex problems in the most difficult circumstances. That cannot survive if we have toxic leadership or if we haven't created an environment where people can bring the best of themselves to work. I passionately believe this.
Thank you, General. Thank you. I'm also very pleased that from the Women and Equalities Committee we have with us guesting Dame Nia Griffiths, so I'll hand over to her.
Well, thank you very much indeed, and I want to specifically focus on the cultural change. I mean, it's 5 years on, and we've heard criticism that cultural change initiatives are still a bit of a tick box exercise, and that actually they don't really engage the personnel with the matters and the solutions that you see. And I just wondered whether that is a fair criticism, and how do you actually embed cultural change in every exercise, every activity, every aspect of service life? And perhaps I could start with the service chiefs. Perhaps I'll start with Chief Marshal.
Thank you. I am seeing the change happen. I think it starts with incentives like very overt and visible role models. So, for example, Mr. Bailey's already picked out one of the role models that's in the room here, but we have really worked quite hard across the Royal Air Force to make sure that we've got the right role models. If I can see it, I can be it. This summer, both the commanding officers, both of our officer school and our aviator school, will both be women. I competed for fairly and won those jobs because of the best people for it. We've just recently had a woman commander come in to run the Red Arrows. Many will have seen that play out in the media. Again, won because she was by far the right person for the job. For me, what the biggest change that I've seen, particularly in the last 5 years in my service, is where we have presented broader opportunities and opened the aperture and removed some of the barriers that were there before and had been for many, many years. Like if you had to be a station commander, you had to be a pilot to be a station commander. Previous service chiefs, thankfully, have removed those barriers. That allows more people to apply and compete for those jobs, and what we're seeing now are more females pull through to those which are quite formative roles, particularly at the wing commander to group captain level, because that sets them up to compete to go right up into air rank. Just as an anecdote, at the end of January, I took my senior leadership team 2.5 days around the Air Force. We visited 8 different stations doing operational updates, and out of the 8 stations, 7 were women station commanders. That would not have been the case 5 years ago. So I am seeing the tangible difference in the Royal Air Force because of the interventions that we've made.
Good, good. Perhaps, obviously, you mentioned role models, and that's extremely important, but perhaps if I could ask General Sir Gwyn Jenkins to focus on the actual mechanisms you're using to get that cultural change into the tasks, into the exercises, into the aspects of the forces life that everyone participates in.
Absolutely. So cultural change for me means systemic change. The culture is the manifestation of the incentives in the system that cause the way people interact with each other. That fundamentally comes down to leadership for me at all levels. Leaders really make a difference within our system. We spend a phenomenal amount of time and effort educating and training our leaders into how to lead. But it comes back to what I said is, unless I can assess the leader actually for the impact they're having on their people, we are very vulnerable to toxic leadership within our system, and it's very difficult to identify individuals who can actually create the environment that we want. I think traditionally, when we've looked at our leaders, we tend to assess the outputs that they manage to create. We're not very good at assessing how they got there in the first place. And this is really important, because I think the leadership at all levels is what will be able to implement the policies that we're trying to create, is what will be able to create the environment for the teams to flourish. We ran our first trial on the new assessment model for leadership in the autumn, and it produced some really interesting outcomes, not least of which was highlighting individuals that in the current reporting system would not be highlighted for promotion, and yet they're creating a fantastic, successful environment for their people. Similarly, highlighting other individuals who might be highlighted as being successful in the current reporting system but are having a very negative effect on their people and are undermining the organisation and what we're trying to achieve. That transparency in assessing leaders becomes a really important part of what you're talking about, which is the actual practical measures that we can bring to bear that will engender the cultural change that we have to have within the armed forces. I think just lecturing people on the culture we want is not going to produce the results that we need here. We've heard today about a whole range of measures that we are putting in place to improve the safeguarding of our people, improve their ability to raise complaints, or improve the position of women within our services in prominent positions. But unless we can reach in and actually make some of these detailed changes, then it's going to take a very long time to get to where we need to be. And we don't have a long time.
So you've done quite a lot of analysis. So
more than analysis, we've actually begun making the change to the leadership assessment models, for instance.
So you're saying that in some cases you have had pushback on some of the cultural change, and that you are actually tackling those leaders in that respect?
No, what I'm saying is that unless we can pick the right leaders at all levels within the armed forces, we won't be able to accelerate the cultural change that we're trying to engender here. It's not necessarily about pushback, but it is about creating what I call leadership excellence, which is people who can both achieve the results that we need for the difficult tasks we do, but do it in a way that help our people thrive within the environments that we put them.
So if I can come now to General Sir Roly Walker, and I mean you've very clearly referenced misogyny in wider society. We've heard about it in schools, the toxic masculinity online. So I'm just interested not just in any sort of pushback you get from some of your more senior staff, but that really challenging task you've made some allusion to of your younger generation of recruits coming in, and how you deal with changing that culture from day one.
Yeah, I will do. Can I just start to confirm one thing, Emma Law, which is that the Children's Commissioner has visited Harrogate on the 20th of January. We haven't seen the report. but we will follow up on the statistics that we discussed earlier on. So,
you know when our report's due?
Nope.
General, no.
No, I don't.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that.
But did visit. I would describe our interventions and around 3, but I'll frame that first. So I met yesterday for the first time one of our officers who's just completed a 4-year PhD, which kick-started in, as I say, 4 years ago, which is looking at the lived experience of Army service women. So this was an opportunity that was taken up a while ago, and she has now finalised her PhD. She goes through Viva, that will be published. And one of her main conclusions is to bring about the changes and the interventions that we want to see, we've really got to focus on our youngest cohort, not just the senior leaders, but our youngest, because that's where the change happens fastest, and it's most easy. She will make a whole series of recommendations, and I would commend her PhD, or certainly the executive summary to it, and I'll be following up with her, and her name is Marshal Grace, and it was pretty inspirational hearing her. So our interventions, therefore, specifically fit round, I won't go into the details, what we call the 8 wells. This is sort of leave well, join well, adapt well, train well, live well. There's a whole series of lines in there, but some very, very specific initiatives around how we develop a cultural measurement framework. I discussed this at the committee last year. That has been rolled out and further developed. Alongside that is the digitalisation of a lot of the resources that we give our junior leaders in order to bring values and standards and behaviours to life, so that we know we can point them what good is and also what bad is and what you do about it. So it comes back to a lot of the work we do in the early weeks at Harrogate is educating on what those procedures and expectations should be. So a whole range of toolkits which are all being rolled out, a series of pilots which have proved to be very, very positive, of giving our junior leaders the resources they need to lead in the way that they want to do. So the plan, in a sense, is and I'm really proud of what my predecessors did with something called teamwork, which is once a year, the Army, less those on operations, stops and talks about teamwork within teams at every level, in every unit across the Army. And that is an introverted conversation about how to make the team a better team. That, in many ways, is how we're bringing significant cultural change in at the lower levels, and that is meeting the very comprehensive Raising Our Standards programme top-down. I think that combination of top-down and bottom-up is making quite a change. And then the third area, which I think we are moving out on and doing more, is essentially a sense and warn facility. This is increasing use of data analytics and finding the signal in the noise of all the surveys that we're getting, which is isolating where are the problem areas, where there is habitual problems, and what are the right interventions to deal with it. So we're getting much, much more precise in those interventions. A lot of this is also picked up, for example, all our one-star commanders now go through a comprehensive, almost rerun of the Army, what was the Regular Commissioners Board, now the Army Officer Selection Board. They go through that on promotion and consideration to one-star command. They effectively go through a retest. Are they still up to the mark? And there's a lot of interventions that happen there that ensure that those officers, when they become senior officers, role model positive behaviours. And also a really key compartment of this sense and warn is the Army Service Women's Network, which I cannot commend more highly to you, at being able to frame and make me realise what this looks and feels like from inside, and to trigger that sense of personal responsibility, professional responsibility, but just human responsibility, to allow our women to do the one thing they want to do, which is to come to work and be safe in their occupational health, as well as their physical health, as well as their safeguarding, and just be respected for serving the nation. It's not a difficult ask. Thanks to them.
Thank you very much. On to Lincoln Job.
Yeah, one for the Director, if I may. The Prospect Trade Union described the MOD to us as, and I quote, one of the worst places to be a woman in the entire defence sector. As the MOD's Director of conduct, equity and justice. How do you react to that perception?
So I think what we have done, particularly over the last couple of years, is quite a few civilian-focused interventions, and I think there's two aspects here. There's one about how we can better support our civil servants. There is another about recognising that they are usually working in a whole force environment. So a lot of the work that is focused on how we better support, better address behaviours, better educate our armed forces colleagues, help support our civil servants. Similarly, we have to hold our civil servants to account for their behaviours as well, equally perhaps their behaviours towards service colleagues. So one of the things that I think we have done is we had a independent review by one of our non-exec directors into the civilian complaints process, and that identified a number of changes that we needed to make in order to make that more robust. Again, similarly to the changes we'd made in the service complaint system a couple of years ago. So we've put, I can't remember, £2 to £3 million into that system. We've significantly increased the number of folk in that complaint system. The My Complaint app that we were using in the service complaint space that also helped us increase engagement with our service colleagues. We've now transferred that into the civilian world as well. I think.
Can we just go back to the perception that Prospect had? Do you think that they're right or wrong when they say that it's the worst place in the defence sector to be a woman?
That they did a fairly small limited survey in this that identified some concerns. I think we are particularly interested in getting a fuller, larger, more comprehensive, sort of analytically valid survey, and one of our ambitions is to do, you saw the sexualised behaviours survey, to do that for civilians as well in the not too distant future. So that will give us, I think, a really analytically valid understanding of the challenge there, as well as the feedback we get talking regularly to folk who are perhaps experiencing some of those. So I think there is some of those concerns we do recognise, and hence we've had those those reviews. One of the things the reviews really highlighted to us was a concern about the civilian casework system. So we have introduced, I can't remember the exact number, 13 or 14 differences to that system, introducing more independence into it, investing further into it, using the app, enabling the ability to report anonymously as well. We have seen, and I know colleagues may or may not see an increase in reporting as a sign of confidence, because one of the points often raised is that people wouldn't raise things. I think we saw a approximately 300% increase in complaints being raised. We have seen complaints being dealt with far more quickly. We have introduced independence in that decision making. All of those are indicating to us an increased confidence in using that system, which then enables us to take action against those perpetrators. Under the zero tolerance policy, I think more than 230 people have exited the services in that period.
I'm getting deluged in process and statistics. Let me ask the question a different way. When you used to work at Network Rail, is the MOD a better or a worse place than Network Rail to be a woman?
I'm hesitant to say things about a previous employer, but I would say actually there are some parallels with the infrastructure industry, which is also extremely heavily male-dominated. I would say that certainly my role there, I saw not dissimilar issues in the broader infrastructure industry. I think when we look at what can we do as defence to improve? Now, in the infrastructure industry, they are reliant on civilian police and the civilian justice system for criminal matters, and they are reliant on employment law and employment processes. We have more control over things like our service complaint system. We have more control over our service justice system, and I have seen more investment in my time in defence to get after these things. I would say I used to work in the financial services industry as well. I have been spoken over, ignored, cut off in all of those environments. I've been asked to make the tea and take the notes in all of those environments. And I've seen colleagues in infrastructure industry who don't have PPE that fits them properly. So that is not to say that suddenly we should rest on our laurels in defence at all. We need to continue to work super hard. But my personal experience, I've seen that in a number of industries that I've worked in.
The Minister has had even more jobs than you have. In as much as you were, I think, briefly a civil servant, then you were in the military, and then it was journalism, and then financial services, and then tech, then as a sort of Labour backbencher, and then as a Minister. So, similar sort of question, because I'm pressing to test whether what Prospect is saying is a valid sort of comparator thing to state. So in all those sectors in which you worked, in all those roles, could you say which was the best place to be a woman and which was the worst place to be a woman?
Honestly, I would say the best place was in the army. And I'm not just saying this because I'm here in front of you in this role at all. You know, one of the most important things that I take seriously as a minister is to hold the MOD to account myself. You know, it's a strange role. I'm not here to, you know, to defend it or lead it. I'm here to hold it to account as well. The structures and processes and people and training in place in the military to invest in you as an individual are really second to none. You know, when I look at my military career, the things I got to do, the things I learned, the people I worked with, the places I went, the experiences I had, were fantastic. And I think we can point to really significant efforts to try and understand the extent of the problems that we have, which I don't think I would see across all of the other organisations that I've worked in, to have the surveys that we have, and of course there's always a differentiation between having a service justice system and obviously there isn't a financial service justice system. But I think one example I think is worth using is on the tube a few months ago, I was subjected to unacceptable behaviour on the tube by somebody I didn't know. And would I turn around and say public transport is not safe or women shouldn't use it? Of course I wouldn't say that at all. And I think it is really important to understand is it doesn't matter where you work, unfortunately, as a woman, that you will be subjected to unacceptable behaviours. And that's why I say that my focus is what are we doing to prevent? We have to do everything we can to prevent, of course. But what is the system that kicks in when someone is subjected to that? But yeah, to repeat my answer to your question, the armed forces.
Okay.
Thank you very much. On to Alex Baker.
Thank you. Minister, I want to ask you, obviously, about properly fitted equipment and body armour that obviously was a big part of the Atherton review. There were clear recommendations on this. Do you accept that it is unacceptable for women to have less ballistic protection than their male colleagues with the standard issue body armour systems that we give out?
Yes, so you know I've had personal experience of this. I can think back to an exercise we did at Sandhurst where, for various reasons, the female platoon we got the body armour and you just had whatever size there was and people just had to grab whatever it was. Subsequent exercise, lots of women injured, and you know some people were like, the girls are going injured on exercise. Of course they were, because they were wearing body armour that was 4 times too big. Of course they were getting injured. I always found it frustrating, the conversation. We make body armour that fits dogs, and if that's a cost-effective thing to do, why not? But one thing I really want to say, and I think this comes back to the previous question about the change in culture since I left, and I think the Atherton report had a big part in this, and I really do tip my hat to Sarah Atherton for how consequential this report has been, is I do think there has been a real step change in the conversations around women's bodies, women's performance, what women need. You know, sometimes there could be a feeling that women would have been allowed to come and join in the armed forces. And I really think that has seriously begun to change. And we aren't embarrassed to talk about now. Women need different body. I would say a lot of men actually haven't got the right body armour. And I think it's really important when we talk about having a range of fits for body armour. It's a range of fits for men and women. and when we're talking about menstruation products being sent down the supply chain, that we're talking about that in a way that we wouldn't have done when I started serving. And, we had a euphemism for these kind of things. And I think for me, when we talk about impacts on culture and we talk about, some of the things that we're doing, but we shouldn't underestimate things like that, which wasn't done to improve culture, but how much more seriously I feel like women are taken.
Which is great to hear, and the evidence clearly shows. The evidence shows that female contoured plates make a huge difference. Actually up to 40% difference in providing increased ballistic protection, but we still don't have consistent provision or a funded programme to deliver this into service.
We have a programme called the Tactical Ballistic Plate Project. We have given comprehensive military advice to ministers, and my understanding is ministers have directed the DNS and therefore the procurement agency to proceed with that. So we would expect to see that on contract in the next few months. That is my understanding of the situation, but the position that we have taken...
Female contour plates.
It is to do with the different body shapes that the minister referred to. So there are men that don't have the same level of ballistic protection because of the shapes of their bodies as well. So this is accounting. There will be 4 variances, the assumption, to account for the variability of body shapes, such that every service person, both in the Army, the Navy and the Air Force, who would wear body armour in a dismounted role will have the acceptable levels of ballistic protection.
I just want to be the thing that I
would
think
hope it
really
would cover contour body.
It has, the female contour is the absolutely key piece, because I have heard it referred to that there is, you're looking at just getting a smaller plate, but actually that doesn't actually answer the issue that I'm trying to solve.
Couldn't agree more, and that's why the initial contract, which we have recommended we proceed and is funded, and there is money in the line for this. As I say, my understanding is that this now sits with the National Armament Director to go to market to work out the best products, the best arrangements. It's not just the plates, it's also the load carrying equipment and how it's distributed on the body. All of that is part of this programme. We're not waiting, is my understanding, for the Defence Investment Plan to be published. None of that. It's get on with it, and ministers have been very clear. Get on with it as fast as possible. It's now down to our procurement agency to work with industry partners to come up with the best way to achieve the outcomes that you speak to, which is every soldier has got, or every service personnel has got the correct ballistic protection based on the threat environment they'll be going to, and that it is sympathetic to their body shapes, which I think covers geometry as well as height and width and various things. Because clearly, and as that longitudinal study we referred to earlier on before you arrived at Standard around women growing crosswear, is you're trying to prevent injuries as a consequence of wearing the right thing.
Yeah, and I've met some of your new recruits, General Roly, who have been seen in selection, yet they are turning up to start their term and actually have not got the kit that actually fits them, even though you've seen them physically, cadets saying to me how frustrated they are to have gone through that process and then to not have that kit. So this is really good news to hear, and this committee is very, very interested in this piece, so we'd be really keen for you to keep us updated on how this process goes.
Chief Marshal, very briefly, you want to
very briefly add that it's the same approach to flying equipment, which is obviously not about ballistic protection, but about fire protection and fire retardancy. Exactly the same approach we're taking with new flying equipment for the body contour. Same goes for the going to the bathroom in the aeroplane, particularly in single-seat fighters. Moving forward with that equipment, so that is a much easier event.
Yeah, brilliant.
Thank you very much. General Jenkins, if I may finish off with yourself, you'll be aware that we've got an inquiry into the Afghan data breach and resettlement schemes, and given that we won't have the pleasure of you giving evidence to us for that, I just wanted to ask you directly, we've heard evidence during our inquiry that a minister asked you directly whether you were going to resign over what had happened. Did you consider at any point resigning or taking leadership responsibility for that breach or any other form of personal accountability?
So I won't step over what an inquiry might say. I can only say that I'm very happy to take responsibility if I'm found to be responsible for that data breach. I never considered resigning because I didn't believe that I was responsible at that point for any of those breaches or that decision.
Right, and also you'll be aware that the verification process has been termed by many as slack and unprofessional because it led to the mass rejection of applications for resettlement to the UK from Afghan triples, hundreds of which were later overturned in a review. So do you acknowledge any leadership responsibility for that?
Again, I don't want to step over what an inquiry might say or might find. All I can say is that the processes that were in place at that time and then were then revised demonstrated that we were a learning organisation and that we were taking action based on discrepancies when they were identified.
Right. Thank you very much for putting that on the record. Look, I'm very, very grateful to all of your good selves. It's particularly pleasing to see all three chiefs appear with the Minister and the Director. And I think that illustrates not only to the Defence Committee but to the wider public of how seriously you take women in the armed forces and the need to improve on this for the betterment of our armed forces and to not just increase recruitment and retention but also to illustrate to young girls and women out there that a career in the armed forces is something that is for them. And we look forward to progress on this important issue, Minister. No doubt we will be discussing this in future as well. But with that, I call to order today's Defence Committee evidence session. Order, order.